You're listening to Breaking Biz Dev with John Tyerman and Mark Wainwright. Conversations that break down, beat up, and redefine business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. And now for your hosts, John and Mark.
Welcome, business developers, to another episode of Breaking Biz Dev. My name is John Tyerman, and as always, I'm joined by my trusty co-host, Mark Wainwright, and we are delivering a series of episodes for you. This is part 2 of a 3-part framework that Mark put together on how to develop new business for your firm. Last episode, we had an episode around creating the kind of firm that you want, not necessarily chasing after RFPs and getting caught on that RFP hamster wheel. So I'm excited to dive into this episode today. Mark, how you feeling?
I'm well. This Choreograph conversation is one that's near and dear to my heart. It follows on the create conversation we had previously. I think that is a fascinating topic about how experts can really flip the script and start embracing the idea that they can create their own futures, create their own new business opportunities, rather than, like you said, waiting for that RFP to drop into their inbox, getting caught up in the RFP pursuit hamster wheel that we all dislike. So Choreograph follows on that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And our next episode is going to focus on contract, which is kind of bringing it all to a successful close. So today, Choreograph.
Choreograph, when you say that, I imagine a ballet or some sort of a dance routine where people are all in sync, everything's flowing, everything is moving, and it seems effortless. Is that kind of what you had in mind?
It is, and actually it brings back wonderful memories of my daughter when she was in ballet. It was really fun to go watch her practice and perform. Ballet is a perfect example because it is an extremely complex dance. You know, it's for obviously for decades, centuries probably. It has existed, and it is the moves are very scripted and very complex and often very, very difficult. But the final product, particularly at the higher levels of ballet, and frankly any other dance, the final product is always so beautiful, right? So seamless, so graceful, so almost effortless. But it's not. You know that there's so much that goes into it. There's so much practice. There's so much rehearsal. And there's this choreography that's going on. And the use of that term is absolutely intentional. I think a lot of people look at, if they consider the world of sales and selling your services and the word dance or choreography, they automatically kind of connect it to saying, oh yeah, two. Yeah, it takes two to tango, right? There's two people involved in this, two parties involved in this, so everyone's got to kind of move through this thing together. Sometimes it's a little tricky, sometimes it really works well. But I really love sort of the spin on it, that additional spin that we just talked about, that choreography makes complex things look effortless. And that's really what I want to kind of hit home is, with sufficient planning and practice, we can all make complex things look effortless. And when you introduce that idea in the world of sales, hopefully there's kind of a light bulb moment. It's like, oh, there's actually a way to do this. There's a 1, 2, 3 ABC, some steps through this. And there's a way that we can plan and practice and guide, prospective clients, prospective customers, and through a sales process and come out the other end. And everyone's really happy with the way it went, and it was successful. And then off we go to really start, in the professional services world, off we go to, deliver our services and provide our expertise and that sort of thing. So that's what I love about that whole term, choreograph.
I'm reminded of one of our earliest episodes, Good and Bad Selling and Buying in Professional Services, Mark, where you laid out this kind of 2x2 of good and bad buyers and sellers and the different combinations that can happen. And one thing that you mentioned is, and I think we'll get into this a little bit, is how from the seller's point of view, you have a lot more reps or at bats at the sales process. So it behooves the seller to lead that process. So on this episode, we're going to talk about the dance, like you talked about. I love that analogy, and why experts, they need that process. So we'll get into why that's so critical. We'll get into what that process looks like, the different conversations that you'll have with your buying counterpart, and then how to stitch it all together. So let's start with why this is so important, Mark. I love that analogy, but let's dig into the why a little bit.
The big why is that sales has always seemed rather ambiguous and confusing and without any shape or form to most professionals. And again, John, this podcast is all about breaking down the complex, taking business development out and roughing it up a little bit and really, shaking things loose. And most practitioners, most people who are that word doer sellers in their firms have no formal training, no idea, no concept that there is the same sort of process, 1, 2, 3 within sales as there is anything else they would do. I mean, even when they're delivering their services. So that's really important here, because these are oftentimes individuals, left brain individuals, architects, engineers, consultants, analysts, other individuals like that who really need some form and framework and structure and process in order to understand something and then be successful.
Let's dig into the sales process that you have outlined here. It looks like there's 4 different kinds of conversations that can happen during this process. There's qualifying, there's discovery, there's proposal, and there's negotiation. So let's start with qualifying. Let's talk about qualifying conversations.
Sure. There's, even before we get into those, John, there's just so many. If you just, bust open our friend Google and just Google, sales stages or sales process, you're going to come up with a ton of kind of responses to that, a ton of information. And you may see some common themes, but you may not,
Right.
And then if your firm has a CRM system, we've talked about CRM systems in the past, the good and the bad. You've opened up your CRM system and it comes sort of out of the box with these things called sales stages, right?
And
there's
Kanban across the top.
Yeah, right. The Kanban across the top. And sometimes there's way too many sales stages. Sometimes there's way too few. People don't really know what they mean. So there's a lot of people out there who have been exposed to the idea of sales stages, but they really just don't know what they mean. So what I'm going to talk through, I'll be as specific as I can, but I would tell you these are probably more general in sort of practice. And what people really need to do is they need to understand how their business functions, what their typical sort of sales process is, how they work with prospective clients from the very beginning to the contract, and then create and fit a sales process with sales stages in it and various conversations to that, right? Your CRM system should not be telling you how to sell your services.
Exactly.
You should have business processes in place that dictate whatever these steps are. But some of the ones that we'll talk about here are the ones that are most common, right? So like you said, the very first one is qualification. And qualification, that it goes by a lot of different words. Some people, if they sort of tilt their head and squint their eyes a little bit, they'll look at this and they'll think this is a go, no go step where they are going to, pursue something or not pursue something. And I would say yes, but it's also a little bit different. So qualification is that very, very initial step. And in this case, John, we're going to be talking about conversations. It's that very initial step that takes a lead, and a lead is a maybe that has yet to be qualified, and moves it into your sales pipeline from a nothing to a there's a there, right? So the whole goal of qualification is to determine fit. Can we be mutually successful together? Can we help them achieve what they want to achieve, the prospective client? And is the prospective client ready to work with us, to compensate us, to contract with us, and kind of walk through this process together. So qualification, simply put, is just to make sure that we are compatible, to make sure that we are ready to work together and roll up our sleeves and take whatever this need or this challenge is on together. The other point that I will hit throughout this entire thing is that all of these are conversations, right? And we will hit again and again on this, John, is that synchronous conversations are critical. And this very first conversation needs to be a conversation, particularly in the complex sale that is, what the professional services world is all about, right? The complex sale demands that each one of these steps is a synchronous communication. You cannot qualify or disqualify a prospective client through some emails unless you're not even in the same world. If I tell people that I'm a fractional sales manager for professional services firms, and I get, an email from an auto parts store that says, hey, we need a, sales manager. I say, I'm not the one for you, but I likely have someone who is. Those are easy, but typically, if people have come to understand sort of the world I play in, we need to have a conversation in order to make sure that we're all aligned and moving in the right direction.
Okay. Qualification, are we in the right ballpark? Are we in the same ballpark? And then, which leads us to your next stage around discovery. And I'm assuming that is learning more. There's some signals that they may be a good fit if you go through those qualification conversations. Tell me more about discovery and what's some of the kind of information that you should be seeking when you're digging deep.
Yeah. So the right off the bat, the important point to make is that I do see these as separate conversations. I do see qualification and discovery as separate conversations. I think sometimes a qualification conversation is really important to have discreetly and separately, 20 or 30 minutes of everyone's time, because you need to sometimes really assess whether or not this is a fit. Sometimes it's not immediately obvious. Sometimes it takes a little bit to process. And the discovery conversation is a more complex, more in-depth conversation that actually needs some preparation. So by separating out those two conversations, at the end of your qualification conversation, you can think about whether or not this is going to be a fit, particularly if it's something that isn't, like I said, screamingly obvious. And then the second conversation, discovery, if you have it as a separate conversation, it gives you time to prepare, right? So that's an important point to make. So the discovery conversation is about digging way deeper. This is about coming in, with a really strong sense of curiosity, coming in, prioritizing, asking questions and learning and understanding. It's often a longer conversation. And if you are a single individual in your firm and that conversation would benefit from other individuals in your firm as well as other individuals from the client's firm, you can kind of bring those folks to bear, because inevitably these decisions are made by more than just two individuals. So this is an opportunity to bring them in. This is a great opportunity for everybody to start learning more and more about each other. And I'll touch on this a bit later, but in discovery is not the time for you to come in and show your slide deck to kind of list all your 1,000 services. It's really a time to be curious about someone else. And the interesting thing is that the questions that you ask in discovery can do a really good job of inferring your expertise. So you don't have to be boastful or explicit about your expertise. We do this, we've done this for this long. Here's our portfolio, here's our resumes. None of that. But the questions that you ask and your level of inquiry do a fantastic job of kind of just tipping your hat and showing your expertise. So that's discovery. And the goal of discovery, the goal of qualification was to determine fit. The goal of discovery is to get all of your questions answered to the point where you are now ready to put forward some recommendations, right? And that, again, is a subsequent conversation. So nothing that we've talked about so far in these 1, 2, 3 steps are, the goal here is to close the deal, right? The goal of the first one of qualification is fit. The goal of this next conversation is understanding. It's like, We need to develop a deep understanding so that we are not guessing, assuming, just running at this thing blind, so that we need to ask the questions so that we are prepared to put forward some recommendations. So that's discovery.
One thing that I found in my experience when I have those initial conversations with prospective clients is the challenge that they think they're faced with sometimes isn't the challenge that they are actually faced with. Sometimes they'll come with symptoms of the problem and think that that's the problem, but really after peeling back the layers, you really find out that there is a root cause of those issues that needs to be addressed first. And so I think that's just kind of like one example of how that can play out, to where, if you build a solution around the symptoms, you're not going to solve the problem.
Good. Yeah. Well said. Well said.
So your next step your next series of conversations in this process, I should say, are recommendations. So let's unpack recommendations, or I call this solution development, but tomato, tomato, right?
Well, the recommendations, it goes by a lot of names.
Sure.
Like you said, solution development, presenting solutions, proposals, all those types of things. So, I will use them interchangeably. I kind of like the word recommendations. Recommendations has kind of a drafty nature to it, and it also comes in with this sort of multiple, right? So proposal often sort of in the word proposal often infers this is final. There's one choice.
That's
take
true.
it or leave it, right? So use those words kind of interchangeably. But at this point, we have learned enough. We've determined fit. We've learned enough in discovery. And again, discovery can be multiple conversations, because you might need to talk with different people at the client organization. You might need to go back to them and say, hey, thank you for that conversation. We got a ton of stuff answered. We asked you a lot of questions. We appreciate your patience. But there are these three other things that we really need to resolve for these recommendations that we'd like to make. Can you give us some clarifying information on these few things? So I think discovery can be multiple conversations, but suffice to say, you can get to a point through discovery where you're now making these recommendations. And one little funny thing I like to do is anytime I'm writing a proposal, writing recommendations, presenting things, and I find myself saying, we would assume this, we would assume this, we would assume this, I go back and I say, no, I can't do that. I need to turn that into a question and then pose that to my prospective client. We can't make any assumptions, right? There's no assumptions. So we make sure that we've got all of our questions answered. So proposal, recommendations, whatever you want to call them, this is continued conversations. This is not a PDF attachment to an email. We will get to that point where that's an important component of this. But right now, we're still talking about conversations. Very early on, we want to present our understanding and just make sure everybody's heads are nodding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did we understand all of this correctly, right? Because this is the foundation. This understanding that we've created is the foundation of what we're going to recommend. And everything has to be, focused on the client. Again, John, we're not talking about presenting your 10 slides with your resume and your bullet points and everything else. And I don't think I'm an outlier in this, and I will tell you, this is kind of an anecdote. I have made it through a complete successful sales process, these sales conversations with clients that are current clients of mine or previous clients of mine, never having done the pitch. Never. I've never pitched,
Yep.
right? It's just, I've never gone through the bullet points and everything else. It just didn't happen. It never came up. Just the conversations and the ease of how we moved through this whole process reassured them, kind of buoyed their confidence in me. And I never had to, go through all of the, bullet points and resume stuff and experience and everything else. And frankly, the second you do that, their eyes start to roll back in their heads and they're like, oh boy, and they just disengage, which is terrible. You don't want anybody to disengage.
And it's not a good use of time either.
No. So we're tightly focused on the client. We're gonna make sure that understanding is correct. And always at the very end of that, in that conversation, we say, did we get all that right?
Right.
Hopefully they're, yes, no, or there's one little thing. Great. Okay. And then we present some recommendations to them, typically, as we've talked about in the past, 3 options. We want to put forward 3 options. We want to make sure that these options align with the things that are most important to them. And if we set some sort of initial pricing, that range, that ballpark that we set up front, we want to make sure that we respect that. Or if they have given us some, like you said, budget, we want to make sure we respect that as well in our options. What that sounds like to me is if someone says we have a dollar amount in our mind and it's this, we say, in our options, we'll always say, well, this is the dollar amount that you provided, and these are the things that can be done within that dollar amount, right? For some additional effort and dollars, we can do this much more. So there's another option, right? So we start working through these options. The goal of a proposal conversation is an acknowledgement or a verbal agreement that says, this looks good so far, let's move to the next step. Again, this is not a close the deal. This is the point of the proposal conversation, is to get everyone saying, okay, let's continue to move ahead, because we're not done yet. Right. Even if someone has verbally agreed to the proposal, we've presented our 3 options and they've picked one, or they're leaning towards 1 or 2 or whatever it is. The goal here is to get them to, okay, let's continue moving. So,
and if folks want to dig deeper onto those topics, we do have a couple episodes recorded. Differentiate your proposals with a statement of understanding. And pricing and choice architecture, help buyers make good decisions. So if folks listening resonated with what you're saying, Mark, I would recommend go and check out those 2 episodes.
Yeah, good. You're listening to Breaking Biz Dev,
the podcast that beats up, breaks down, and redefines business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. Your hosts are John Tyerman, founder of Red Cedar Marketing, the podcast marketing company for experts and professional services firms,
and Mark Wainwright, principal consultant and founder of Wainwright Insight, the fractional sales manager and sales consultant to professional services firms.
If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by following the show and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts.
And now, back to the show. So that's our proposal conversation, and the last one, John, is negotiation. And I think any well-formed, well-sorted proposal needs to be negotiated. If you find yourself in a situation where it's not, maybe you left money on the table, or maybe you guys were just completely out of sync and they said no, or they said yes immediately. So I think negotiation always is an important part of it. And negotiation really talks through any issues that they see, anything they're concerned about. And again, the goal of negotiation is to get the deal done, right? Is to get the contract signed. But in order to get that contract signed, you have to make sure that the legalese is aligned with whatever everybody wants. I mean, I have a fairly standard sort of agreement or contract that I use. And it's funny how different clients, and typically it's their sort of legal representative, whether it's someone inside the firm or outside the firm. It's funny that certain, lawyers or their legal folks, they love to kind of just pick on different parts of different contracts. So people get obsessed with certain clauses, or the fact that there's stuff in there or not stuff in there, or whatever it is. So it's kind of funny, and you have to walk that through. And again, this is really important, as a conversation. What I have found is that a lot of people start firing back these documents that have red lines and corrections and additions and, deletions and everything. And all of a sudden things get really confused. So you have to say, time out, let's just talk, right? Yeah. Because with all of those red lines and those edits and everything, there's some level of detail behind that. That there's a reason why they're doing it, right? And a lot of times that's tied to risk, is that, well, this presents way too much risk for our firm, or this doesn't clarify enough this particular point. So great, we can do that. And when you are coming into negotiations, there are opportunities to mitigate risk. There are, and for as crazy as this sounds, for high dollar complex professional services, you can offer money back guarantees. I do this frequently when I talk to prospective clients, and I can tell they're really close, but there's still some reservations. because when I work with firms, I do it pretty intensely. And, there's not just risk that they're not going to achieve what they want to achieve, but they're letting loose this sales manager guy on their firm, and they're a little bit nervous about it. So, a lot of times I will mention that, look, we're at the very end of this conversation here. I can sense that, we're all moving together. We're in agreement. Here's the last little thing that I want to make sure I mention, because, I stand behind what I do. If in the first 90 days we're, after that 90-day mark, if we have a conversation and things have just not, gone well, we haven't synced up, things aren't moving in the right direction, people are not kind of processing and understanding this, I'll just write you a check and give you everything that you've paid me to date, and we'll call it done, right? So that's one of the tools that I use, and I think that lets people just, right, their back is kind of tense, they're a little bit nervous, and they just relax and they exhale a little bit and they say, okay, great, that works. So again, the goal of negotiation here is to get that contract, get it across the line, and sometimes it just drags on, but negotiation, get it across the line and get it contracted.
So to recap, the 4 stages: qualification, and the goal of qualification is to see if you're a good fit. Are we in the same ballpark? The second conversation is around discovery, and that the goal of discovery is to understand your counterpart, your buying counterpart. The third series of conversations are recommendations. You might call it proposal. And the goal of that is to develop a solution that is mutually agreeable, that addresses all of their concerns. And then finally, the fourth sales conversation or series of conversations is around negotiation. And the goal there is to close the contract, is to come to a solution that everyone can agree upon.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, and again, people will search for various types of sales processes and they'll come up with a bunch of different answers. But I think if you look closely enough, there's some common themes that we've talked about here today that you'll see in just about anything you come across out there. So that's the conversations. But this next thing, John, and I know this is a whole other chunk. This is a whole other part of this conversation, is how we move this through, how we make those things look graceful, right?
Yep. So those are the stages on paper, but it's not a 2-dimensional process. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things that you as a salesperson can do to help move buyers through this process. So let's unpack that a little bit. So you've got a list here of some things that business developers can use to help move buyers through this process.
Yeah, and there's 8 of them, and I know that we're coming up on time here, John. But we're just gonna put our heads down and we're just gonna go through this. So
with the power of editing, we can make it seamless.
Yeah, right. I think it's entirely possible that we will unpack some of these things in the future. So just kind of stay tuned for that. So I'll list the 8 real quick here. First is curiosity and inquiry. Second is low self-orientation. Third is focusing on results. Fourth is synchronous conversation. 5 is seeking and building understanding. 6 is mirroring and reflecting. 7 is seeking and gaining permission. And then 8 is guiding, confirming, advancing, and connecting. That one's kind of like that's the kitchen sink one that I just kind of threw everything into. So that's the 8. And I think we can just kind of breeze through these fairly quickly at this point.
Let's breeze.
Good. All right. So curiosity and inquiry, we've talked about this. This is, again, these 8 points that I'm making are things that will stitch all of this together, meaning that all of these should be present throughout this entire process, right?
That's a good point.
There's just not these 8 things don't find themselves just in different stages. They are the thing that what is the word, it just came to me, this thing. What is it? Is there a waft and weck? Is that new for you?
Yeah.
That's, you know what that is? That's, when they're weaving cloth, when you're weaving cloth, they have the strings that are in tension, and then they're moving that little thing back and forth together, that little yarn back and forth. So they're creating this cloth here. And that's what we're doing, John. We're creating the cloth. Our sales conversations are the strings in tension, and then we're weaving it all together. So there you go. I just brought in another crazy
Mind blown.
boom.
That's
There it
awesome.
is. Yeah. Okay. So curiosity inquiry, right? It lets us put aside our expertise, just set it aside for a minute, and just be super curious and super focused on them, on what's going on in their world. It presents this great posture of openness, lack of ego, a desire to really learn, which is great. And that's really wonderful for a prospective client to perceive. They want to know that we're curious and really focused on them.
Yep.
And I mentioned this before, that being super curious infers, and asking great questions infers our expertise through really good questions, rather than us just feeling like we have to be explicit about it, about showing them our resumes and years of experience and all of that. So curiosity and inquiry get woven through all of this, every single stage, right? I mean, even in negotiation, right? You need to be curious.
Sure.
You
need to understand why those lawyers are redlining everything, right?
Yeah. What's your concern here? Break it down for me, right? What's the concern? All right. So the second one is low self-orientation. And this pulls a little bit from the trust equation that comes from the book, The Trusted Advisor. It was written by David Maister and Charlie Green. And the trust equation, you guys can look it up. It's I think a really nice articulation, particularly for the technically minded professional services people out there. The trust equation is great, right? So it talks about the components, all the things that contribute to trustworthiness, right? So we're not talking about trust, we're talking about trustworthiness. Those are different things. Okay, so this is how the equation plays out. In the numerator, above the line, we have credibility, we have reliability, and we have intimacy. So the numerator, the components are credibility plus reliability plus intimacy, right? And we're hopefully scoring along here. So credibility are, I can trust what they say, that they have the resume, they have the experience, all that sort of stuff. Plus reliability. Reliability means that you have their back, that they can believe you at your word, that sort of stuff. Plus intimacy, which is a kind of funny word to use in a professional sense, but intimacy is professional intimacy. It's professional closeness. It's that, I can be open and honest with this person. Right. I can be transparent with my challenges, my problems, all that sort of stuff. So score all of those over the denominator, self-orientation, right? So high score in the numerator, low number in the denominator creates a high sense of, or a high level of trustworthiness, right? But, low numbers in the numerator with a high number in the denominator, self-orientation, which means that we're just going to talk about ourselves this whole time.
Yeah, that's the sleazy car salesman.
Sleazy car salesman gives us a low score when it comes to trustworthiness. So there you go. There's the quick trust equation. People can dig into it, but I think that's critical. Just staying focused on that. And self-orientation is one of those things that when we, without even knowing it, without intending to, when we get in uncomfortable situations and when we are unclear about things, our default setting is to talk about ourselves because we just don't know anything else. So that kind of works against us with this whole trustworthiness thing. Even if we don't intend to, even if we're not needing to be boastful or, oriented on ourselves, it just happens because that's our default setting. So it's something to consider.
And so maybe some of these other tools can help you in those situations where you don't know what to say, pausing, mirroring, curiosity, so forth.
Totally. All right. Next one is, where are we? 1, 2, 4.
Focusing on results.
Focusing on results, right? So focusing on results gets everyone really staring at what's most important here. Not focusing on deliverables, not focusing on hours, not focusing on days, not focusing on 1, 2, 3, focusing on what's the big thing we're all chasing after together and keeping that kind of in clear focus. Because if you are not focused on results, the alternative will be your prospective clients will start to micromanage and focus on the wrong things. They'll focus on, oh, we were a day late with this deliverable. Oh, this happened, whatever. Where's that little thing? What's going on here? So they're focused on the wrong things. If everyone's focused on the big picture results and there's different things that happen on the pathway to achieving those results, then everybody can flex with it and say, look, we are still moving towards those results. We're on pace, we are on schedule, everything is fine. So we're good. Plus, if we're focused on results, it lets us measure how we're doing. That's how we're going to achieving those results is how we're going to measure this. It's not these little incremental things. So that's important.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And now the fourth one that you have on this list, and you've hammered it a few times, synchronous conversations. Let's talk about the importance of synchronous conversations in a time where you can have so many asynchronous conversations.
Yeah. When is the last time, John, that you were able to resolve a really complex issue through a series of text messages?
Not on text. Text is one of the worst.
Never.
Yeah.
Never.
Email, text, no.
Yeah. So and even texts are even almost synchronous, but they're still not, right? There's still plenty of room for interpretation and, I sent that text and they're not getting back to me. So, it's just so hard, right? And particularly in this complex world of selling professional services, which is hard. It's hard to buy. It's hard to sell. Why add a level of complexity and confusion to it with asynchronous communication? So all this needs to be synchronous, right? We need to have a series of conversations from the very beginning to the very end, right? So we're able to avoid misinterpretation. We're able to bring in greater clarity, because I think most buyers, are operating a little bit of the fog, and we can start to clear away that fog and help kind of guide them through this whole thing, through these synchronous conversations.
Yeah.
The other thing that there's a few other components of this, just making sure that we're having conversations elevates this whole process beyond just a series of, kind of half-baked emails, right? So it elevates this to, this is important to me, this is important to you, let's have a conversation, right? The other great thing, there's so many, but synchronous conversations let you see that body language, back and forth, if people are agreeing, if there's nodding heads, if there's concerns, if there's furrowed brows, all those things. And then if you are in conversation with someone, throughout this whole process, you are constantly getting really valuable pre-contract, early leading indicators of what it's going to be like to work together. Right. So that's important.
That's a really good point.
Super important, right? So you're understanding how they like to communicate, what the back and forth is like, how you're, just how sort of simpatico or aligned you are, together. And that's really important. You can't really tease that out of a bunch of emails. That's really difficult. So that's important. And if things aren't going the right way, you need to look at those signs and say, this is not going to be a good fit. So that's the importance of synchronous communications.
Excellent. And so the next one we've talked about a bit earlier on in the discovery and qualification conversation, seeking and building understanding.
Right. Throughout the entire process, from the very beginning, from the very first qualification to negotiation, in qualification, it's, have you worked with organizations like ours in the past and how did it go? Right. There's an understanding question that happens really early on. I ask that in my qualification conversations. In negotiation conversations, an understanding can be, I understand that you have concerns about this particular thing. Can you tell me more about that? Right. So all throughout the entire process, it's you're gathering information, and then you're constantly sort of trying to achieve understanding so that everybody's all together. The other really important thing about understanding, we've hit on this in the past, is that if you come into any one of these conversations with a really healthy, posture of just wanting to understand and wanting to explore, that it helps others feel heard.
Yes.
Right. So people experience those conversations and leave those conversations thinking, wow, they were just really curious. Mark was really curious. John was really curious about us, and he wanted us to articulate the things that are going on in our world. And he felt those were important, right? He felt that us kind of uncovering these, root causes, like you mentioned, or, whatever else is going on. He brought more sort of weight and credibility to those things that we're kind of sensing might be a problem. So we feel heard. So this is super super helpful. So that's understanding.
And you can do that, and you can help folks feel more comfortable and vulnerable and elicit more understanding with some of these more tactical empathy tools. I read a book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, and he mentioned some of the ones that are coming up on your list here: mirroring and reflecting. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's the next one. Mirroring and reflecting. There's a bunch of different components and definitions of this. Mirroring and reflecting can be anything from mirroring your posture. Again, this ties into the synchronous communications. Either if you can do this anyway. You can do it on a telephone too. You can do it in person in a video call in a synchronous communication. You can mirror their body language, if they have a particular expression, or if there's words they use, or if there's just a kind of a body language posture they take, you can mirror that, which means that you are understanding that, you are processing that, and you're reflecting back to them. You're letting them know that their posture, their approach, their demeanor is a good one. It's okay. And you can create a sense of familiarity and comfort there. So that's kind of mirroring. So the whole reflecting is constantly taking in information and reflecting back to them and say, did I hear that correctly? Right? Can you further clarify this? The other last component of this that I want to touch on ties into this whole understanding thing, is that when you do your follow-up in any step in this entire process, you reflect back to them everything that you heard, and you can do that in an email, right? So it's just this, maybe bullet points, maybe it's a brief narrative that you reflect back to them. And, I understand you said this, you mentioned this. It's worth noting that, this thing is going on. There's these other points. And then your final little sort of question you put in that email is, did I get all of that right? Right. So that's that whole mirroring and reflecting thing. In person, it can be done. And then in your follow-up, it can be done as well.
Those are great points. So mirroring and reflecting, mirroring their body language, some of the words they use. What I like to do is pick up on keywords and turn that into a question.
Yeah.
And then use a pause. It gets them to think. And so the seventh bullet point that you have here is seeking and gaining permission. So why is permission important?
Well, this is important enough, John, that somebody wrote an entire book about it called Permission-Based Selling, right? And I'm spacing on the author right now. We'll link to that.
Link to that in the show notes.
In the notes. But yeah, this is an important thing. And permission is always presenting the opportunity for someone to opt in, meaning that, before you ask any questions throughout any of these stages, if you don't mind, I'm just really curious about you and your organization. I have a number of questions to ask. Is that okay? Question mark, right? And people are generally agreeable. So they'll say, yeah, great. And then you can move on, right? Before sending them something, maybe they've said, hey, that particular thing, that link to that podcast or that article you wrote, that sounded like something that we'd like to read. You can say, great, I've got the link. Can I send it to you? Great. Get them to kind of opt in to it, right? Setting next steps, something that's always difficult in these series of conversations because we want to tie them all together. Mm-hmm. Hey, can we set a next date and time for our next conversation? Is that okay?
While we're on the call, hey, while we've got 5 minutes left on our call, is it okay if we set a date for our next conversation?
Right. Can we do that right now? Can we look at calendars and this thing? Yeah. Well, but hopefully they agree to it because they understand that keeping this thing moving is important. So is that okay? So very simply put, right, we're constantly seeking and gaining permission. We're presenting opportunities for people to say yes, to kind of opt in. And it's not a trick. It's just that's super important for people to be constantly opting in, and they're displaying to you in a very explicit way that they want to keep moving forward. So that's great.
Excellent. And then this last bullet point here, and I'm feeling the flow here, the choreography, guiding, confirming, advancing, and connecting. It seems like this last one it's your job as a sales professional to just keep things moving.
Yeah, totally. So guiding with the whole word of choreography, right? There's often someone leading this, buying complex professional services for all of you business development folks out there, whether you're a doer seller or someone else. Buying your services is hard. It's complex. So you need to be a guide. You're not pushing, you're not forcing, you're not demanding, you're not doing any of that. You're just being a really, really helpful guide, because it's hard. Because you've likely done this, you've sold your services more than your prospective client has bought them. Chances are pretty good. So it's important for you to be the lead. And a good lead lays out a rational, reasonable process that you can walk through together. Confirming is clarifying how far we've gone so far together. Every time you're interacting, the first part of your conversation was, hey, we had that last conversation last time. That was really great. I appreciated that. I reflected back to you. I shared my notes. I shared my understanding with you. Did we get that right? Great. Now let's move forward. And we do that again and again and again. So we're always kind of backstopping our progress so that we don't slide backwards at all. And sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where new decision makers or new individuals join the conversation. Mm-hmm. So if you talk with one person and now there's 3 on the next call, I'll make sure that everyone has read the summary that I provided ahead of time, and I'll check, right at the beginning of the conversation. Okay, I provided that understanding. Did everyone read it? Was it all clear? If you haven't read it, let's read it right now. Right. Yeah. So then they'll go and they'll search in their emails and they'll open it up and they'll read it. That time is worth it. Right. It'll seem silly, but that time is worth it. So make sure we're all in lockstep together. And then the next thing is advancing, right? Making sure that we're always setting these nice incremental steps and these incremental goals, right? If you kind of understood when I talked about the sales conversations, this series of steps, that we're always moving forwards. Exactly. But we're not always like the goal of qualification, like I said, is not the contract, right? Right. We always just want to make these nice incremental steps forwards. The goal of qualification is fit. The goal of discovery is understanding. So we're always setting and achieving these kind of incremental moves forward. So everything is just flowing, which is great. The nice thing about new business opportunities that continue to advance and continue to move is that they just have this nice energy and momentum, right? They just keep moving. And the ones that stall, we're like, oh man, now there's ghosting and all kinds of other stuff going on. So what a drag. And the way that we do that is we make sure that we are connecting each one of these conversations, each one of these activities with one another. So we're always setting next steps. We're always sort of chaining, like links in a chain, each one of these conversations, one to the other, right?
And referencing back to past conversations too.
Yeah, referencing back to past conversations. We're not just assuming that everybody on the call kind of gets it. We're confirming that. We're making sure that we're all aligned and moving forward together, but we're always connected. We're always connecting everything, because the broken chain, the broken communications, the broken links in this whole process here creates confusion, and the fog starts to settle in. And all of a sudden you think, I don't really know where we are right now.
Mark, I think that these are all really great pieces to the puzzle, and I think it was worth going a little long on this episode so that we could cover all of this, because we're taking bits and pieces of different topics that we've covered on this show in the past, and we're putting it together in a format where I think this is where a lot of folks will get stuck, is how do we implement, how do we do, how do we execute? And so I think you laid it out very well, talking about the different conversations, talking about how they're sequential, they need to be synchronous, and there are a bevy of tools at your disposal to help you move those conversations forward. So this has been a great chat, and folks that are listening to this, thank you so much, and stay tuned for the next episode to come out, which will talk about contracting and finalizing that contract.
We will. John, I know this was a lot to dig through, but I think we did a pretty good job. Until next time.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Biz Dev. Subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or listen to the show at breakingbizdev.com. This episode was produced by Red Cedar Marketing. If you think a business podcast is right for your company, visit redcedarmarketing.com to learn more.